Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. I'm Drew Chappell, sitting in this week for Karen McCarthy. In this edition, the mystery of Scott Guy's killer may not have been resolved, but what the high-profile murder case did throw up was questions about rural property disputes. We talked to a barrister and legal journalist about what you can do to avoid costly court cases and plan for the future. And in one of the most stressful jobs in the world, the financial and farming pressures often push people to the brink. We talked to a scientist who studied the effects of high pressure and anxiety on farmers all over the country. And with warning examples aplenty, where can you turn if you're battling to stay afloat or just worried about your family's future? We talk legal planning and rural support. Well, joining me now to discuss stress, succession and court this week are AgResearch Senior Scientist Dr. Neels Botha and barrister and legal commentator Catriona McLennan. Thanks to both for being here.
Kia ora.
Well, I thought that I would start with the case which has gripped the nation over the last few weeks, the trial of Ewan McDonald for the murder of Scott Guy, which of course we must remind everyone he was found not guilty of. But as a professional, were you looking at that case and thinking, as the evidence came out, that perhaps this is an issue that is more widespread than most people would perhaps realise?
I think there's a lot of issues that perhaps the public might have been alerted to that the public doesn't really realise, but perhaps have been brought to the fore by that case. And I think probably the issue that we're looking at today is that it's really important to prepare for succession in your farm. And it's far more important in the rural context because all the tensions and hostilities and problems that might cause are magnified because, of course, it's not just a work environment, but everyone's living together on the farm. So there's far more interaction. And there might be marriages, cousins, people working together. So it just makes it far more vital. And what I've really noticed is that, unfortunately, succession is not well dealt with on many farms, and that's really evidenced by the number of cases that go through the High Court. After farmers die, they might have made a will, but perhaps all the property's going to one child and not the others, or it's divided very unevenly and it ends up in the High Court, which is just the worst thing that can happen. It takes years to resolve those disputes, and it's also really, really expensive. There was a recent case that I think we're going to discuss a bit later, and that was $416,000 in legal fees. And I mean, I'm a lawyer, but that's just a complete waste of money. That should be going into the family business and into the family, and definitely not going to lawyers.
Yeah, because I mean, you work so hard to build up that
Absolutely, yeah. So I think what people need to think about is succession, and it's important to understand succession is not just for when the farmer dies, but also to think about and make legal arrangements for if you become incapacitated. So that might be, you might have a stroke or a heart attack or a very serious accident, and that can just be, in the blink of an eye, and then overnight you're not able to run the farm or look after your affairs. So it's not only having a will on death, but it's very important that farmers talk to their lawyers and put in place what's called an enduring power of attorney. And you can do that at any time, and that just provides for, if one of those things does happen to you, suddenly you can't run the farm, then you've made arrangements for a trusted person to look after your affairs. Because I think non-lawyers might just assume that your spouse or partner can take everything over and run things, but actually they can't.
That's not the case, yeah.
No,
we might come back to that in a little while, if that's right. But Dr. Botha, of course, when we talk about some of those pressures that perhaps drive people to we clearly saw that there was a lot of stress and tension between members of the same family in that case. And you led a team doing a study about some of the effects of that pressure on farmers all over the country. Maybe talk a little bit about how that sort of all got started.
We started a few years ago, about 3.5 years ago. There was a big drought in the Waikato, and a lot of people talked about what's happening on farm, and particularly, people get stressed and worn out and feel weary, and a lot of them don't know where to go. So we got a group of people together and we started talking about it. And it was pretty obvious, that we don't have enough information. We don't know really what's happening. So we were successful in getting some funding. So we started our studies to find out what's really happening on dairy farms in particular in terms of stress. Yeah.
And so the sample size, was it mainly dairy farmers that you were looking at, because of course drought affects them particularly?
Yeah, well, we started with a group of 15 farmers. We did case studies, but it's grown much bigger now. So at the moment we look at population size or sample size of about 500 every year, and that's nationwide. The first study was just in the Waikato. So we're getting bigger numbers now, just to, get a better feel for what's happening across the country.
And get that data a bit more reliable.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you noticed any clear distinguishing trends during that time? I know 3.5 years is a short amount of time to see a pattern, but has there been any major trends?
No, not really that I can say, well, it's quite significant. Yeah. I think our findings show that what's happening on farms are not that different to the national population. So, the levels of stress and depression and anxiety, things like that, are quite comparable to what we see in the New Zealand population. That doesn't mean that it's acceptable. We can normalise things that are not okay, and I don't think we should be doing that. But no, we can't do a trend analysis at this point in time.
But I mean, I guess anecdotally, it's sort of, and internationally as well. Yep. I mean, we've seen there's perhaps a greater depth of data in other countries around the world where agriculture is similarly important.
Yeah, I think so. In particular in Australia, they've been putting quite a bit of money into finding out what's happening on their farms. People are there quite isolated in many cases, and when they talk isolation in Australia, they mean isolation.
Yes.
Not like New Zealand. I mean, some of our farmers are quite isolated, but nothing compared to what they're doing there. So we don't have good data in terms of farmer health and farmer mental health and so on. We just don't have it. For us in the Waikato, it's important to reach people before they actually hit the wall. Although we know a lot of people wait until they can't go on, especially males. They tend to do that. And once they hit the wall, they look for support, and often that's a bit late. If we can get to them sooner, once they begin to show the signs of distress, that'll be great if we can achieve that. Yeah.
And Catriona, have you seen in some of the cases that you've observed as well the fact that perhaps if things had I suppose been dealt with sooner, that we wouldn't have got to the stage where court proceedings were needed?
Absolutely. I mean, court proceedings in themselves just escalate and magnify tensions and hostility, because everybody has to file affidavits and they all put the worst things in them about each other. So definitely, if things can be dealt with at an early stage, that's much better.
As you were saying before, often the court proceedings will happen perhaps after a death or after someone is unable to speak for themselves. And if things were dealt with before that point, then it wouldn't be necessary to deal with it later on down the line.
That's why it's so important to put a plan in place. And then I think it's really important also to talk to your family about it, so that it's not a great surprise if you die and the will is read and then people think, oh, we had no idea, and they're completely shocked. So it's much better to sit down and talk about what you're planning and discuss it. And the other thing is that people sometimes assume that they've got complete freedom to leave their property any way they want, but under the law that's not actually the case. So people need to take that into account as well.
Great. Well, coming up after the break, we talk about the very real effects of stress on farmers and their families. Is it pushing some to the brink? Stay with us on Straight Talk. Welcome back. I'm Drew Chappell with Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow, and our guests Catriona McLennan and Dr. Neels Botha. Well, Dr. Botha, I thought that I would start by asking the drivers behind a lot of the stress that you were seeing in the Waikato. What were some of those causes, the things which were really ramping up the pressure on farm for people?
In our Waikato study, we found sort of three main factors contributing to stress. One was the drought at that particular point in time, so it's environmental driven. Then we also had some financial issues, people with high levels of debt struggle to service those. And then also the influence of the changes in environmental policy in New Zealand impacted in the Waikato quite substantially in terms of stress. They've got a helicopter, flying over farms and so on, and quite a few farmers talked about that and say, when we hear the chopper coming, we know it's not here to save a life. It's actually here for something else. And because at that point in time, many of them were uncertain whether, they were in breach of some of the rules and regulations. They were unsure what's going to happen, and really put some stress on farmers here.
Right, so it was perhaps the issue about, that they weren't sure what was coming next in terms of policy. It wasn't very clearly signalled to them what was required.
Well, policy keeps on changing, and I know farmers say that, they don't get warning in advance. I don't think it's really always the case. But as the sand shifts under them, they feel uncomfortable. A lot of them put in, say, new effluent systems, and it could cost them up to $50,000 or something like that. And then just to find out 6 months later that it doesn't really comply with the rules and regulations. So it does create a lot of stress.
I noticed one of the questions in the survey was about work-life balance and how satisfied they were with it. And I noticed no one that was polled, certainly in the study that I saw, ticked either the satisfied or very satisfied box. So, I mean, I suppose that indicates that there could be a problem perhaps with farming in general. Yeah.
Well, I think, farmers tell us that they love what they do, although they get stressed sometimes, and some get more stressed than others and so on. But a lot of them actually, I think, farm for being out there, working with animals and the freedom of it. And if you call it lifestyle, it seems like people are doing nothing. They just laze around, which is not true. But farmers really love what they're doing. I think quite a few of them don't get it right in terms of balancing up, the demands of farm work and so on with family and other commitments that they do have, and that can create quite a bit of stress. In our surveys, we find, there are 4 things that actually create quite sort of stress with farmers, and top of the list is actually people issues, which has got to do with staff, employment, managing staff. Having said that, we've got many farmers who actually are excellent employees and they get it right. But for a group, they struggle with that. They say, I never went into farming to manage people. I love working with animals and love the land and so on. And suddenly, because the units get bigger, and so I get a bit older and I've got to bring in staff. And they find that quite stressful.
And I guess also the fact that these are people, and people who work in the city, perhaps you can work with people that you work with during the day and then go back to, say, your family in the evening. These are people you can't get away from.
Oh, yeah, excellent. I mean, they live in the office, they never get a break. So that can create a bit of stress as well.
And I suppose also the fact, and Catriona, you've probably seen a bit of this as well, because people are so isolated, it's difficult to run away from your problems, and so things exacerbate themselves and they get worse, and tensions within families can really sort of erupt.
That's absolutely right, because as you say, they're all living and working on the same premises, and I think some of the cases in court show that very clearly. Yeah.
What are some of those cases? I noticed you've sent me through a few examples, a couple that have taken place over just the last few months or even years.
Yeah. Well, I keep an eye on cases going through the courts, particularly relating to farming succession, and unfortunately in New Zealand there are always cases going to the High Court where there's disputes about farming succession, how the property's been left, who got what, who didn't get enough. And as we were talking about before, farmers should really aim to avoid that. It's the last thing you want to have, all your hard-earned money going to lawyers and really having bitter and hostile family disputes, because once you've had such a terrible dispute, it's very hard to rebuild the relationships. And so how could people actually work together on the farm afterwards? Lots of these cases involve farms that have been in the family for several generations, and I think probably in the past it was very common that all the property was left to a son, and that was kind of accepted, but things have changed now. And so I think if you're thinking of leaving all the property to a son, I'd say don't do that, because it's almost inevitably going to end up in the High Court. Often one lawyer will be acting for all the family, and you can quite understand why that happens, because they're in an isolated rural area. There probably aren't many lawyers, and there's not that many lawyers that deal with rural law. So of course when the family finds someone who knows about that, they tend to take all their family issues there. But this lawyer acted for the mother, the father and the children, and what that is likely to involve is a conflict of interest. And so if a lawyer has acted for everyone, that can also be challenged in court. So in this case there was a court challenge brought to how the property had been left in the will, but also the lawyer was sued because the lawyer had acted for everyone, and the son's interests were different from the daughter's interests, mother's interests will be different from father's interests. So in that case, the lawyer was actually found to have acted improperly, and the High Court awarded damages of $135,000 plus interest against the lawyers. So
wow.
It was actually probably the interest bill that was even larger than the $135,000. So that was a pretty significant penalty, and it just is a really good lesson to farmers that, you know, get other family members to see a different lawyer, because then it makes it more likely the case will stand up in court.
Yes.
And then I think the case that people always remember is a case that I love because I'm an animal lover, but a farmer in South Auckland, he had a $4 million estate, and he actually left $1 million to his 2 dogs, which I thought was great. But of course the rest of the family wasn't so happy, and so there was a challenge brought in the High Court, and what happens then is that the High Court under the Family Protection Act can basically rewrite the will, and that's what happened. And about 50% of the property was left to his 3rd wife. Nothing at all was left to the dogs under the High Court judgment, because the judge said that the widow would provide for the dogs, so I hope she did.
Yes.
And then what the farmer had done, as well as leaving $1 million to the dogs, was leave most of the rest of his estate, not to his 2 sons, he'd had an argument with them, but to the 2 sons of family friends. And so the High Court rewrote that bit as well, and each of the 4 men got 10% of the property. So you can see that's really different from what the farmer had provided originally. Also, you can imagine the tension, terrible family dispute. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask Dr. Botha about. Do you find that when farmers are feeling pressure, perhaps, and when things might be getting too much, that perhaps things are not maybe taken out, but certainly they manifest themselves in the family unit as well? You know, that perhaps family relationships break down because of something that's happening on farm.
Yeah. Something that's quite interesting that sort of stands out to me is that, you know, people can cause a lot of stress, but they can also make the stress go away. When the relationships are going well, it's sort of a source for them to draw on in terms of mitigating stress. But when things go wrong, it really can blow up for farmers. Quite interestingly, you know, when farmers get stressed, they don't really talk about it. That's not too surprising. We find about 50% of them, when they're in need to talk, they don't really do that. So we could argue, is a glass half full or half empty?
Yes, yeah.
I don't know, but I would think we can do better there.
Yeah.
But when they do talk, they prefer not to talk to professionals. You know, they talk to the spouse, family members, or a good friend.
And of course, if things sour, I guess, in the family unit, then all of a sudden their sole confidant becomes, you know, a source of distress.
I mean, you lose that source, and social connection is really important for people when they're stressed, because it gives you resilience when you've got your social contacts, you know, and the relationships are healthy. It's a good source to draw on when you get stressed.
And as opposed to, I suppose, maybe bottling it all up and heading out on a 2 or 3 day sort of going bush, as they say in Australia.
Yeah.
You know, taking your aggression out on either the
dog.
Out onto the land, you or the dog.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. I mean, if you don't talk about it, what do you do? So people handle it in all sorts of different ways, and we see what farmers do are no different to what other people do, and when they're stressed, you know, they're just human beings. Well, so a lot of them prefer to work through it.
Yes.
They just work harder, you know, or they play more sport. And interestingly, we've learned that male depression is slightly different to female depression. It manifests itself a bit differently, so often we don't pick it up.
Well, don't go away, because there's more in store after the break, including places to look for help if you're under pressure or trying to decide how to split your business and keep everybody happy. Stay with us on Straight Talk. Welcome back to Straight Talk, of course, brought to you by Straight Furrow. We're back with Catriona McLennan and Dr. Neels Botha. And Dr. Botha, just before the break, you were talking about the differences that you were noticing between male and female stress. Is this just because people deal with things in a different way, or is it because perhaps there are slightly different drivers for stress in both those situations?
I think the drivers are the same, but people experience it differently. And I think there's a gender difference, generally. What literature says about depression for males seems that it can be quite different than what females experience. So males tend to do what blokes do when they get stressed. They drink more. They tend to drink more and they don't talk. They sort of bottle it up. They may work harder and longer hours. They may spend more time at work. They may spend more time doing sport, things like that. They may chase women harder and then end up in all sorts of trouble. So when those things happen, they may also engage in dangerous activities like driving too fast and those sorts of things.
So sort of destructive behaviours?
Well, yeah, generally I think we would say that's not constructive. At least it's quite destructive, yeah. So when males do that, people just think, they're just being male. But it could be a sign that they emotionally not well and that they can be depressed, actually. And
the female side of things, how is that different in terms of the
Well,
coping?
females tend to be more in contact with their emotions, so they tend to talk more, and they tend to open up towards their friends and so on, and they tend to get more relief from stress that way. And that's generally speaking, but males tend to do the opposite, most of them, yeah.
And I guess if you have a case where they're both feeling this stress and pressure, then it's somewhat of a sort of perfect storm as the two.
Well, it can. I mean, the one wants to talk and the other one wants to keep quiet and work hard and so on. And I think, people need to learn how to deal with that. The first thing is probably to learn how to recognise the symptoms that things are going off the rails and then say, well, let's just stop. And think about this and then look at different ways of managing this.
What sort of are some resources that are out there for farmers? Perhaps if someone's watching this and thinking, that could well be the case in my family, where would you say that is a good opportunity for people to go for answers to questions?
Drew, when people get stressed, they sometimes get overwhelmed by everything, so they really don't know where to go and what to do. First port of call could be your GP. Go to your GP if you don't find joy there. And I think GPs are very busy and generally they don't have the time to sit down and talk for hours about your stress and so on. But they're really a good port of call. Rural Support Trust, always a good source to go to, and many areas of the country, they do excellent work in terms of sitting down with farmers and just sorting out the issues on farm. Now, they don't really deal with emotional issues, but they are all farmers. Active farmers, and they leader farmers, people who others look up to, so they can help farmers to sort out what needs to be done and how to treat things. They are also in contact with counsellors that they particularly work with, so they can then refer farmers on to either lawyers or bankers or counsellors, whatever the case may be.
So if perhaps an avenue that someone looks to doesn't have the answers, they would at least know of someone else or an area to go to.
Exactly. The Rural Support Trust is an excellent conduit for people, to channel them towards sources. If people feel, they want to speak more privately, they can always call Lifeline. And this is it's not only about sort of suicide, they also do a lot of other things online. Farmers are connected in terms of the internet, so there's a lot of resources online. If you think of the John Kerwin initiative, he's got a journal and so on that's available online and people can go there. So there's a lot of resource out there actually if you have issues, yeah.
And with staying with that, the online resources, are there places perhaps because legal advice isn't too prevalent perhaps in some areas of the country, there are places that people can go for advice online?
Definitely. Citizens Advice Bureau, it has lots of offices all around the country, but they also have an 0800 number, so you can ring up and talk to them about a problem, or you can actually email. So if you go to their website, you can email in queries, and if they don't know about it, what's great about them is they've got such a big network, so they'll go to someone who will know about it. And there's also 26 community law centres all around New Zealand, and some of them also provide phone advice. And as you were saying, there's so much stuff on the internet now, and all the court judgments we've been talking about today, people can look at judicial decisions online, they can find all the judgments, they can look up the acts that we've been talking about, the Family Protection Act, they can read all that. And then lots of law firms have newsletters, so if you look at what law firms are based in towns near you, lots of them will have newsletters and they'll cover issues of interest to farmers. So they'll quite regularly do stories about wills and succession planning. So yes, there's a lot of help out there. You just need to know where to find it, basically. Yeah.
So there are places where people can go. That's, I suppose, a good note to leave it on. Well, you've been watching Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. Thank you very much to my guests, Catriona McLennan and Dr. Neels Botha, and as always to you at home for watching. If you'd like to get in touch, check out the Country 99 TV website for details on Straight Talk and all our other programs. I'm Drew Chappell, and we'll see you next time for more Straight Talk.